If you find yourself duplicating code across controllers, one option would be to move that code into a factory. So in this section, we're going to talk about what a factory is and how to actually create it through a module. Now, a factory itself, as mentioned earlier, is really just a singleton. It's a way to define reusable tasks. It could be calculations, business rules, AJAX calls, or really a multitude of other things you might be doing. You could also even use it to share code or state between controllers, and that makes it so that if one controller is alive and then goes down, another one comes up and wants to get to the data, then they could both go through the same factory to do that. And as mentioned, many other things could be used for this process as well. What we do with a factory is create and return a custom object, and you'll see this in just a moment. And then later I'll compare and contrast this approach with what we do to create a service. So with a factory, though, it's really important to note we create and return a custom object. Now, the way we create a factory is much like the way we create a controller. With a controller, we go through module.controller. Well, with a factory, it's module.factory. We simply call that function, we pass in the name of the factory, and then the function that defines what it is we want to do. Now, once you've created a factory, you can inject that into other components. One example would be you might inject it into a controller, but you could also inject it into another factory or service. So factories can really be reliant on other factories or services as well. And then they can have their own set of dependencies. So for example, you might need the $HTTP that I showed earlier because you want to make AJAX calls. Now, the process of creating a factory is actually very similar to creating a controller, just a few different keywords. Now, the big difference, though, is that with controllers, you get a new instance every time a view loads that controller. Whereas with a factory, the first time the factory runs, the instance stays in memory, and it's a singleton. So everyone shares that same instance. Now, what we have here is our typical wrapper function to make sure nothing's in the global scope. I'm going to focus on the JavaScript for my factory first and define one called customers factory, assign it a function, and then inside, what we're going to do is create a custom object. So in this case, we have some customers, and you'll see we'll return those here. But we're actually going to create a custom factory object, and then we can assign one or more functions and even properties onto this particular object. Once we've defined it and hooked in all the functions, such as the getCustomers function here, we can then return that factory out. That takes care of defining the factory, but that really has nothing to do with AngularJS at this point. That's standard JavaScript. So we are going to return a custom object, but we need a way that Angular knows about this custom object. So the way we do that is we can use angular.module, get to our module, and then do the .factory, and then give it the name. Now, I normally like to match up the name with the name I give up here, although it really doesn't matter, but you'll notice that we're going to pass this function as the second parameter, and this should look pretty familiar because this is what we did with controllers a little bit earlier in the course. So in this case, to add a factory, we simply call module.factory, give it a name, and then give it the function on what to do. So what I really want to emphasize with a factory, though, is that we create a custom object, we control what goes in it, and then we return it out of the factory function. And you're going to see when I get into services, that's the big differentiator. Now, an alternate syntax that you'll also see out there is shown here. So what I could do is I still have my customers, but instead of doing the factory that was just an object literal with some functions on it, we could just return an object literal, and in this case say getCustomers, give it the function, and then return those customers. Really doesn't matter how you do it. It's kind of up to you. I like the previous approach, but some people prefer this way, and everybody does it different. So I'd say pick what you're comfortable with. But regardless of that, we return a custom object, and then we have to register that object with AngularJS as mentioned, and we do that here using the factory syntax. When it comes to using a factory, once you've defined one, how do you make it available to, say, a controller? And in this case, we have a customer's controller, and you can see we have the scope injected. But the second parameter here, this is going to represent our custom factory. And so what will happen is as long as you've registered this factory with AngularJS, using the syntax I just showed, Angular at runtime we'll automatically inject this in, and then we can use that factory to go get some customers in this case. Now, what's nice about this is you can see it's going to keep our controllers and even other components out there that might use factories really clean and focused. And that way we're not worried about adding all the code into the controller. We can actually modularize our app, and that's going to make it a lot more reusable and hopefully make it easier to maintain as well. Now, when it comes to the minification, we talked earlier about $inject and how if the scope parameter up top gets renamed, we'd still be okay. Same thing here. If this were to be renamed just C, that's going to break everything because it's going to look in the module for something called C, won't find it, and then error out. So we'll also have to put in customer's factory if you're worried about minification type scripts like Uglify.js. So just kind of be aware of that. It's easy to forget this, and if you do, it'll definitely mess things up. So let's go ahead and jump into a demonstration now of using a factory. And what we're going to do is modify the controllers we've created up to this point, refactor some of that code, and move it out to a factory.